In the brutal arithmetic of World War II armored warfare, there was one fundamental, unbreakable rule for reconnaissance crews. If you spot the enemy, you report their position, and you run. For years, to stay and fight in a lightly armored scout car was considered an absolute death sentence. But what happens when you give those vulnerable scouts the firepower of a frontline tank? What happens when the hunted decides to become the hunter? It's 1942, the Libyan desert. A British reconnaissance patrol spots German armor moving like a steel shadow across the dunes. In any other armored car of the era, the crew's only option would be to hit the throttle and flee. They observed, they reported, they fled. But the crew of this specific vehicle did something entirely different. They didn't run. They turned directly toward the enemy and opened fire. At 400 yards, a 2-pounder shell struck a German half-track, instantly bursting it into flames. Before the enemy could even process what had hit them, the British car seamlessly reversed into cover, repositioned, and engaged again. This was not how armored car warfare was supposed to work. Doctrine across Europe emphasized that reconnaissance vehicles should avoid decisive engagement at all costs. But the British had built something strange, something that gave their crews a choice. To understand why this strange vehicle was so revolutionary, we first have to understand the nightmare that was British reconnaissance in the early years of the Second World War. The problem was simple, and it was brutal. British armored cars were hopelessly, lethally outgunned. Let's look at the arsenal they were working with. The Marmon Harrington carried a boy's anti-tank rifle. The Humber mounted a 15mm Besa machine gun. The Morris had a boy's rifle and a Bren gun. Theoretically, these weapons could damage enemy vehicles. But war is not fought in theory. In the harsh reality of combat ranges, they completely lacked the penetration to reliably stop advancing German armor. The boy's anti-tank rifle was heavy, wildly inaccurate, and its brutal recoil physically punished the crews who had to fire it repeatedly. The 15mm Besa was certainly better than a standard machine gun, but it was still totally marginal against anything with real steel protection. When British armored cars encountered German vehicles equipped with rapid-fire 20mm autocannons, the exchange was practically a slaughter. Reconnaissance patrols quickly devolved into suicide missions. British crews were forced to watch helplessly from the dunes or the tree lines as German vehicles maneuvered around them. They knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that engaging the enemy meant their own destruction. This disparity wasn't just a technical failure, it was a psychological disaster. British reconnaissance commanders were struggling to find volunteers for forward patrols. The men knew exactly what was being asked of them. They were being sent forward to observe an enemy they could not fight, strapped inside vehicles that could not protect them. Morale plummeted. Intelligence gathering, the very lifeblood of a military campaign, suffered drastically. The entire reconnaissance function of the British Army was fundamentally compromised because the tools were simply inadequate. The British desperately needed something that could fight back, but the engineering challenge to create such a machine seemed almost mathematically impossible. In the world of tank design, there is a golden rule. An armored car needs to be fast enough to scout, light enough to be mobile, yet powerful enough to destroy enemy vehicles. Conventional engineering wisdom said you could have 2 of those qualities, but never all 3. Tanks sacrificed speed to carry heavy firepower and thick armor. Scout cars sacrificed firepower to maintain top speed. No one, not the Germans, not the Americans, not the Soviets, had successfully combined genuine tank-killing anti-tank capability with the high-speed mobility required for reconnaissance. If you put the weight of a real anti-tank gun on a wheeled vehicle, it would slow it to an agonizing crawl. The violent recoil of firing the gun would literally tear a light chassis apart, and the massive ammunition storage required would consume every inch of available space for the crew. Engineers across the globe had tried and failed to solve this riddle. The Americans gave their M8 Greyhound a 37mm gun, but gave it paper-thin armor. The Germans built massive, impressive 8-wheeled vehicles, but restricted them strictly to observation roles. No one thought you could put a proper heavy tank gun on a fast armored car and actually make it work. But the solution to this impossible paradox came from the most unlikely of sources. BSA Cycles, a company far better known for manufacturing everyday motorcycles and bicycles. They'd won a contract to build the Daimler Dingo scout car back in 1938. The Dingo was a tiny, plucky, two-man vehicle meant purely for sneaking around and observing. But the company's chief designer, Sidney Schulbred, looked at this tiny scout car and saw a canvas for something terrifying. What if they scaled up the Dingo concept and armed it with a real gun? Not a machine gun, not a light autocannon, a proper armor-piercing anti-tank weapon. In April 1939, Schulbred's team began work on a project they initially dubbed the Light Tank Wield, and that name captured their ambition perfectly. This was not going to be an armored car pretending to have firepower. It was going to be a light tank that just happened to have wheels instead of tracks. For the gun, they chose the Ordnance QF 2-pounder. This was the exact same 40mm weapon fitted to contemporary British frontline tanks like the Crusader and the Valentine. It fired armor-piercing rounds at a blistering 792 meters per second. This was enough kinetic energy to completely destroy any German armored car and most early Panzer models at combat ranges. No other nation's reconnaissance vehicle carried anything even close to this comparable power. To house this massive gun, they didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They simply took the turret directly from the light tank Mark 7 Tetrarch. Suddenly, this wheeled vehicle had the firepower of a British tank, 3 times its weight. But the gun was only half the genius of the Daimler. Because it weighed 7,500 kilograms, nearly twice as much as the little Dingo it was based on, the transmission faced enormous strain. Schulbred's solution was nothing short of mechanical sorcery. He installed a Wilson pre-selector gearbox combined with a fluid flywheel. What does that mean in the heat of battle? It meant the driver could select his next gear before he actually needed it, and then engage it instantly with just a tap of a pedal. The fluid coupling meant the engine could never, ever stall, even under extreme combat stress. But here is the true party trick of the Daimler. It had 5 forward gears and 5 reverse gears. It gave identical performance in either direction. A driver could push the car to 50 miles per hour on the road, engage the enemy, and then reverse away at that exact same 50 miles per hour without ever having to turn the vehicle around, keeping the heavy front armor and the gun pointed squarely at the threat the entire time. It had speed, it had firepower, it had mobility. The team had achieved the impossible. Production was slated to begin in April 1941 at Daimler's Radford Works in Coventry. And then the Luftwaffe intervened. Devastating bombing raids from the 8th through the 10th of April rained fire on Coventry. The factory took severe damage, but British manufacturing refused to die. The company immediately dispersed its operations across central England to avoid total destruction. It was a logistical nightmare. Armored car assembly was moved to Wolverhampton. The complex gearboxes were manufactured in a hosiery factory in Leek, and those heavy tank turrets, they were built in an underwear factory in Colville. Despite the bombs, despite the chaos, production proceeded steadily. 135 vehicles rolled out in 1941, 721 in 1942. By the war's end, 2,694 Daimler Armoured Cars had been birthed from these scattered, improvised factories, ready to equip reconnaissance regiments across every single British theater of operations. So, what happened when this underwear factory-built marvel finally met the enemy? In early 1942, the 11th Hussars received their Daimlers and immediately put them to work in the western desert. The transformation was instant. Patrols that had spent the last 2 years running for their lives were now actively hunting. The 2-pounder could easily crack open a German Sd.Kfz 222 at any combat range, while the German 20mm shells simply bounced off the Daimler's 14mm sloped frontal armor. Reconnaissance was no longer defensive. It was an offensive weapon. One account from the period captured the mood perfectly. The crews finally felt they had a car that was superior to the German equivalent. The 2nd Derbyshire Yeomanry used them to conduct screening operations that completely blinded German reconnaissance, gathering vital intelligence on Erwin Rommel's troop dispositions. The King's Dragoon Guards pushed deep into enemy territory, confidently engaging targets of opportunity that previous cars would have been forced to ignore entirely. Look at this photograph from January 1943. It captures a Daimler opening fire in the gloom of early morning at the start of the battle for Tripoli. Throughout the pursuit across Libya and into Tunisia, Daimler crews racked up kills against German half-tracks, scout cars, and soft-skinned vehicles. The psychological effect completely flipped. German scouts, who once operated with total impunity, now found themselves facing vehicles that could destroy them at ranges where their own weapons were entirely useless. But the desert was open. It was a long-range shooter's paradise. What happens when you take this vehicle into the claustrophobic nightmare of Europe? Italy presented entirely different challenges. The 11th Hussars landed at Salerno in September 1943, fighting through the rubble of Naples and up the peninsula. The mountainous terrain severely limited vehicle movement, yet the Daimler proved equally deadly in close quarters. Its compact dimensions and that incredible reverse driving performance allowed crews to poke out from tight ambush positions, fire their 2-pounder, and vanish backward before the enemy could traverse their turrets. Then came D-Day, the ultimate test. On the 6th of June, 1944, C Squadron of the Inns of Court Regiment landed with the 3rd Canadian Division on Juno Beach. Their orders were near suicidal. Dash inland immediately and blow the bridges over the River Orne. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Daimlers were knocked out on the beaches by hidden mines and massive German 88mm guns. The exits were choked with wreckage. Crews took heavy casualties within hours of their tires touching French sand. Yet, despite the devastating losses, the regiment pushed inland. They were later described as having covered themselves in glory. Even against overwhelmingly superior weapons, the Daimler's ability to fight back gave these crews a fighting chance, a chance they never would have had in earlier vehicles. As they pushed into Normandy, they encountered the bocage, ancient, dense hedgerows that limited visibility to mere feet and channeled movement into predictable, deadly kill zones. The standard Daimler turret sat too high, presenting a clear target over the hedges. So the British did what they do best. They improvised. The Inns of Court Yeomanry created what they affectionately called SOD vehicles, sawn-off Daimlers. They literally removed the heavy turrets entirely. These low-profile command cars could now navigate the sunken lanes undetected. It was a brilliant, improvised solution that proved just how adaptable the basic Daimler chassis was to conditions its designers had never even dreamed of. By September 1944, The aggressive doctrine the Daimler enabled was put on full display. On the 3rd of September, Lieutenant Roger de Wandre of the 1st Belgian Armoured Car Squadron roared into the Belgian capital aboard his Daimler Mark II, aptly named Calamity. He was the very first Allied armoured car to enter Brussels. They had pushed far ahead of the main battle forces to seize key objectives. Belgian citizens mobbed the vehicles, overwhelming the dusty, exhausted crews with gratitude after 4 agonizing years of occupation. A few weeks later, Operation Market Garden saw Daimlers of the 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment scouting for the massive 30 Corps, desperately trying to push relief forces up Hell's Highway toward the beleaguered paratroopers at Arnhem. Though the operation ultimately failed, the Daimlers successfully navigated around heavily fortified German defensive positions that would have utterly stopped less capable wheeled vehicles in their tracks. To truly appreciate the Daimler, we must measure it against its peers. The standard German scout car, the Sd.Kfz 222, with its open-topped turret, left crews highly vulnerable to grenades, shrapnel, and the weather. The Daimler's fully enclosed turret protected its men, and its gun easily overmatched the German vehicle. What about the legendary German Puma? The Sd.Kfz 234/2 Puma was, on paper, arguably superior. It had a massive 50mm gun, 30mm of frontal armor, and an incredible 1,000-kilometer range. Post-war historians love to praise the Puma as the best armored car of the conflict. But there is a catch. The Germans only ever built 101 Pumas. The Daimler outnumbered it 26-1. And further, German doctrine still heavily discouraged aggressive reconnaissance combat. Even the best equipment in the world matters very little when your tactical manual tells you not to use it. And the Americans? They built over 12,000 M8 Greyhound vehicles, prioritizing sheer mass production over crew protection. The M8 had a decent 37mm gun, but its floor armor was a shockingly thin 3 to 6 millimeters. It was catastrophically vulnerable to landmines. British crews who were forced to operate American M8s literally had to line the floors with heavy sandbags just to survive. Whenever British units were given the choice, they universally preferred the deeply protected, highly mobile Daimler. And incredibly, the Daimler wasn't done evolving. In 1944, an invention called the Little John adapter transformed its killing power. Named as an anglicization of its Czech inventor's surname, Janicek, this device was a squeeze-bore attachment fitted to the end of the barrel. As special tungsten core ammunition traveled down the barrel, the adapter physically squeezed the shell down to a smaller diameter, dramatically increasing the pressure, the muzzle velocity, and the penetration power. Suddenly, this 1939 design could punch holes through heavier late-war German armor. While the tungsten ammunition was scarce, and it meant they couldn't fire high-explosive rounds, the fact that you could just bolt an adapter onto the existing gun barrel proved the fundamental, undeniable brilliance of Schulbred's original design. On the 3rd of May, 1945, the 11th Hussars led the 7th Armored Division into the ruins of Hamburg, bringing the Daimler's war to a fitting, poetic close. The exact same regiment that had first proven the vehicle's worth in the scorching sands of North Africa had now driven it all the way into the darkened heart of the German Reich. No other British armored car could claim a combat record stretching from the deserts of El Alamein to the streets of Hamburg. But the Daimler refused to retire. Post-war service extended its career far beyond what any of its creators could have ever anticipated. The British Army retained them until January 1960. In the late 1940s, the British developed a replacement vehicle called the Coventry. But during testing, they realized a startling truth. The older Daimler was still better. Production of the Coventry was cancelled after just 220 units. The Daimler had outlasted the very vehicle designed to replace it. India used them in the high-altitude mountain terrain of the Himalayas during the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Malaysia used them to hunt communist insurgents through dense jungle tracks until 1960. And Sri Lanka retained their Daimlers through their 1971 insurrection, reportedly keeping some operational all the way into the late 1990s. Nearly 50 years after Sidney Shoolbred scaled up a tiny scout car, it was still fighting. Today, out of the 2,694 vehicles produced, only 41 survivors remain. It is a sobering testament to exactly how hard these vehicles were used, living their lives at the absolute tip of the spear. The Daimler Armoured Car succeeded because the British dared to ask a completely different question than the rest of the world. While other nations asked, "How do we build the best scout car to run away?" the British asked, "How do we build a vehicle that can scout and fight?" It required revolutionary engineering. It required the resilience of factory workers dodging bombs in underwear factories. But most importantly, it required the willingness to challenge centuries of military doctrine. The strange British armored car that hunted German tanks instead of running from them wasn't strange at all. It was the brutal, logical, magnificent answer to a problem the rest of the world had accepted as unsolvable. British engineering gave reconnaissance crews a choice, and that choice made all the difference.